Pubs, particularly in the Victorian era, were often divided into lots of small internal spaces. If you've spent any time in pubs, you're probably familiar with terms like public bar and saloon bar. Today, although most pubs tend to have open plan layouts, we can still often see tantalising hints of the way things once were. I've touched on this in previous videos, but I thought it was worth a deeper look at these internal spaces. Who were they for? What did they look like? How were they used? When did pubs first start to be divided up like this? And when did these divisions start to disappear? First, some background of what came before these Victorian ideas of pub interiors. As the term public house suggests, many of these places started life as private dwellings that open up to the public for the sale of food and, more importantly, drink. So in the Georgian era, pubs would often have had different rooms inside, but that's often down to the fact that they were adapted from residential dwellings. Mark Girouard's excellent book on Victorian pubs, first published in 1975, refers back to an encyclopedia of architecture from 1833. That contained a chapter on the different types of public houses and inns that were present at the end of the Georgian era. That gives us a valuable snapshot of what the Victorians inherited. Let's start with the most basic type of pub, which the encyclopedia refers to, I think somewhat condescendingly, as a hedge alehouse, the most humble form of rural pub. There are only really two public spaces here, the taproom, which also doubled as the kitchen, and the parlour. The bar, as labelled on this plan, would not have been open to the public. That would have been a space for the master of the alehouse to observe proceedings from. As Mark Girouard described it, the taproom was usually sturdily and simply furnished with wooden tables, fixed wooden benches around the walls, and a large open fireplace. In contrast, the parlour was for the more genteel customers and had pictures, higher quality furnishings, and chairs rather than benches. From that description, it sounds to me like a forerunner of the public and saloon bars already existed at that time. They just had different names, the taproom and the parlour. It's perhaps worth pausing here to consider the etymology of the taproom. That originally meant the place where the barrels were kept, and therefore the place where the drinks were served from via taps. That might still have been the case in this hedge alehouse at this time, particularly as that room doubled as the kitchen. Elsewhere in that 1833 encyclopedia, there's an example of a suburban public house. The areas of this pub which are open to the public are shaded in blue on this plan. The rest were just used by the owners and staff. Again, we have a choice of two seating areas for customers here, the tap room and, as it is labelled here, the company parlour. I assume that's company in the sense of guests, as in we're expecting company, and that meant an area open to the public. And it was there to contrast with the bar parlour, which was a private space for the owners of the pub and possibly their staff. This was also a very early example of a pub which actually had a bar counter. In fact, the encyclopedia contains a sketch of this. It looks to me as though it had hand pumps and also drinks fountains and is in a very recognisable form to what we would see in a pub today. And yet this was pretty much 200 years ago. There's also a drawing of the bar area behind that bar counter, and you can see barrels and shelving for storing the other drinks on offer. Bar counters seem like a defining characteristic of pubs today, but they actually only started to emerge in the late Georgian era. According to Mark Girouard, the idea actually came from gin shops. You can see a gin shop depicted here in this caricature by Cruikshank of 1829. We need to take this interpretation with a slight pinch of salt. Cruikshank clearly had a bit of an agenda here. He was trying to demonise gin shops, but you can at least see there clearly is a bar counter. If that famous piece of Hogarthian propaganda, Gin Lane, is to be believed, then people consuming the spirit behaved like animals, so some separation between staff and customer seemed prudent. That said, customers inside the gin shops were not kept separate from each other, and as you can see from Cruikshank's depiction, it was an open plan free-for-all. The efficiency-loving Victorians may have disapproved of the gin shops, but they saw how the bar counter made transactions quicker and easier compared with serving customers at their seat. So during the Victorian era, this became the norm in public houses. Although, that said, table service was retained in the posher bits of the pub in some cases. At some point in the Victorian era, the tap room was more or less replaced by the public bar. The public bar was typically the most down-to-earth bit of the pub. Broadly speaking, it was where the working class drinkers were to be found, and depending on the exact era and location, typically just the men. The decor and furnishings were usually more basic than other parts of the pub, and in some cases it was standing room only. The prices would have been different between the different parts of the pub, and the public bar would always have been the cheapest. When did the term public bar first start to emerge? The earliest newspaper mention I could find of public bar clearly referring to a space inside a pub is in 1848. That page of that newspaper has a number of adverts for public houses, beer houses and gin shops at that time, but only one of them mentions public bar, suggesting it was a relatively new term. Almost all of them mention a bar parlour, but this term may have been in a state of flux from the purely private space for the owners of the pub towards possibly a space that loyal customers may have occasionally been invited into. There is a surviving example of that today at the Bridge Inn in Topsham near Exeter. In Manchester, we saw the public bar being referred to as a vault, and I suspect that has a similar derivation to the tap room. Vault is of course another word for cellar, and that would have been the place at one point in history where the barrels were kept and therefore the beer was served from. What about the saloon bar then? The parlours of the early 19th century fulfilled a similar role to the saloons of the late 19th century, but the transition was not a direct one. Like the parlour, the saloon would have been the posher bit of the pub, reflected in smarter furnishings and higher drinks prices. Roughly speaking, a more middle-class environment. In some cases, rather than ordering drinks at the bar in the saloon, there would have been table service. We saw examples of this in Manchester, where the saloon bars had bell pushers so that the customers sat therein could have drinks brought to them at their seats. You can also see examples of this at the Bear in Oxford and elsewhere in the country. The decor in the saloon bar would have been a bit smarter than in the public bar. One distinction we sometimes see is the use of fielded panelling, particularly in the interwar period. This was considered a bit smarter than the matchboard panelling, which was common in public bars around that time and possibly even a bit before. In some cases, the saloon bar might have been the bit of the pub more amenable to ladies. This depends a little bit on the exact era of history we're talking about and the precise location. As noted, the shift from the parlour in the early 19th century to the saloon at the end of the 19th century was not a direct one. The first usages I found of the term saloon bar weren't until the 1870s, so we therefore have a period of perhaps 2 or 3 decades after the advent of the public bar and before the saloon bar became established. During this period, the trend seemed to be towards an ever-increasing number of private spaces. The public bar continued on as normal for those customers who either didn't care about or couldn't afford to pay for the additional privacy. But for those customers who wanted a more discreet experience, the booths, snugs and compartments were there. Although we don't have any surviving layouts from that mid-Victorian period, here in London at least, some late Victorian refits which introduced saloon bars seem to have kept some of those private compartments. Taking the Princess Louise as an example, the partitions were reinstated in 2008 based on a plan, I believe, of the 1891 remodelling of the interior. I assume this front space was the public bar. There are 2 larger spaces towards the back which were probably both some kind of saloon bar. In the 1890s layout, but between those were 4 compartments, and they're quite likely a vestige of the pub's original layout when it was first built in 1872, when it probably would have had even more private compartments than it does today. Mark Girouard pins the advent of the saloon bar to the early 1880s based on the earliest architectural plan he found. However, one of the earliest mentions I found of a saloon bar in the context of an internal space of a pub is in 1877 here at the Grafton in Kentish Town, a pub which still exists today. Alas, the interior today is very modern. There are possibly 1 or 2 earlier, maybe early 20th century touches, but generally speaking, it is a typical 21st century open plan pub today. So I can't really get much sense of that saloon bar from its current incarnation. However, it was described at the time as being perhaps unsurpassed. There's also a note that it brings a valuable, respectable and profitable addition to the trade. An allusion to the fact that these spaces were aimed at more middle-class customers and the prices were higher. It even goes on to add that the trade was being done entirely at the counter, so this particular saloon bar at that time did not offer table service. The 7 stars here at the back of the Royal Courts of Justice feels like an appropriate venue at which to talk about the saloon bar, the public bar, and how they became represented in the law. Despite the somewhat organic way the public bar and saloon bars evolved over the course of the 19th century, in the early 20th century they did become enshrined in legislation to some extent. The Licensing Consolidation Act of 1910 stipulated that premises must be structurally adapted to the class of license which is required. 2 bar rooms in order to qualify for a full license which allowed them to also sell spirits. There is a claim that is how the Dove in Hammersmith ended up with that famously tiny bar room, but that has been contested by beer writer Martin Cornell. Although the legislation doesn't explicitly mention the public bar and the saloon bar at that time, I think that is the underlying intention for specifying those 2 bars. That suggests to me that spirits were more commonly sold in the saloon bar at that time. Later in that decade, during the First World War, we again see the divide between the public bar and the saloon bar reflected in legislation. The Beer Prices and Description Order of 1917 enforced maximum prices on beer in public bars of licensed premises. Publicans could still charge whatever they wanted in the saloon bar, but the same beer must also be on offer in the public bar at the government stipulated price and no more. Predictably, that led to some legal wrangling about how exactly these bar rooms were defined. Here is a newspaper account of 1918 of a pub in Manchester where the public bar had been closed, and there was then a debate about whether the saloon bar had become the de facto public bar or not. The public bar and saloon bar are not the only spaces we still see vestiges of in signage from these late Victorian pubs. Let's look at a few of the other examples. First of all, the private bar. It's quite common for pubs which had a public bar and a saloon bar to also have a private bar, and this is perhaps of those 3 the space which is the least understood today. It's possible this was a bit of a catch-all which had different usages in different contexts, and it may also have been a vestige of that period in the mid-Victorian era when we were transitioning from parlours to saloon bars. In Maurice Gorham's book The Local, published in 1939, there's an entry for the private bar which describes it as a compartment halfway between the public bar and the saloon bar, now tending to disappear. Where it is found, it's rather apt to deputise for the ladies' bar. It seems the name is chosen in part to contrast with the public bar. The public bar was often something of a free-for-all where it would be the norm to talk to strangers. So it's likely the implied social contract of the private bar was that you kept yourselves to yourselves and only talked to the people that you went to the bar with. A lot of pubs still retain snugs and booths, some particularly fine examples being the Old Mitre in Holborn, the run of booths that we have in the city of of York, also in Holborn, and the Barley Mow in Marylebone. These would have filled the same role as the private bar, they just weren't specifically labelled as such. By the time of Maurice Gorham's updated back to the local in 1949, he declared the ladies' bar to be a relic of older manners fast dying out. This would have been a space for unaccompanied ladies, and men were apparently not allowed in this section at all. Only a few known examples of these spaces still remain, including the Prince Alfred in Maida Vale and the Boleyn Tavern in East Ham, although I think both have lost their original signage. A segue there to talk about Snob Screens, a feature you can still see in a number of Victorian pubs around London. One of the finest examples is in the Prince Alfred in Maida Vale, where I was earlier, and also here at the Lamb on Lamb's Conduit Street. It was typical for these partitioned pub interiors to be arranged around island or horseshoe bar counters. So although there were partitions between the spaces, by looking across the bar counter you could potentially see and be seen by people in a different bar room on the far side of the pub. Snob Screens have these rotating panels so that customers can briefly open them when they need to talk to the bar staff, perhaps to order a drink, but then can be closed afterwards so the prying eyes of other customers elsewhere in the pub can't observe you. Mostly when we see these in pubs today, they are a modern reproduction, or in an entirely incongruous location here at the Lamb. I think they are actually in their original position, which is quite unusual. They were originally located in the sections of the pub where there were customers who wanted more privacy. In some cases that might have been more middle class customers of the saloon bar, not wanting to be observed by the working class customers of the public bar. Or it might have been in the private bar where there were customers trying to have discreet conversations, or as is the case in the Prince Alfred, in the ladies' bar, wherein the ladies wanted some privacy from the male customers elsewhere. One interesting aside about Snob Screens is that we're not actually sure what the Victorians called them. I couldn't find any written references to Snob Screens prior to the 1940s. One other sign we sometimes see in entrances or former entrances of Victorian pubs is Jug and Bottle, or some variation thereof. Many Victorian pubs would have provided a separate entrance and a small internal space providing access to the bar for customers wishing to buy drinks, predominantly beer, to take home. Today, it's rare to find pubs which are still divided up into those spaces we've been talking about, the public bar, the saloon bar, etc. Quite often where those partitions do exist, at least here in London, they've been reinstated in recent history. That was the case at the Princess Louise, as we saw earlier. In the vast majority of pubs today, the interior is open plan. It's tempting to say the removal of those partitions was a very literal example of breaking down class divides, but I think there is actually more to it than that. The reasons include a straightforward element of fashion, changing usage patterns of pubs, and also cold hard economics. I couldn't find any mentions at all of open plan in the context of public houses in newspapers prior to the 1960s. But in that decade we start to see reports like this one of the Cavendish Arms in Doveridge in Derbyshire. Another factor which contributed to the decline of public bars and saloon bars was the advent of food in pubs. By, say, the 1960s, it was getting increasingly difficult for publicans to turn a profit on drink sales alone. A larger focus on food often meant a perceived need for a dining room inside the pub. That often came at the expense of either the public bar or the saloon bar, sometimes both. Here's one example to illustrate. The White Hart in Reigate was remodelled in 1967. And it says in this article, the old saloon bar has gone to make way for the enlarged and modernised dining room. Note the menacing but sadly prescient title of this article, A Look into the Future at the Old White Hart. In 1975, there's a newspaper account of Charrington's Brewery wanting to knock together the public bar and saloon bar into one space in one of their pubs and redecorate to saloon bar standards. That, of course, meant charging saloon bar prices throughout. This particular case seems to have gone all the way to the High Court, and surprisingly, the judges ruled against the brewers. However, I suspect that is the exception rather than the rule at this point in time. This was just a brief respite for this particular pub. The pub in question was the Romans in Southwick, or is it Southwick, near Brighton. Looking at cameras listing for the pub, it seems the two bars were finally joined together in the early 1980s, so the brewers did get their way in the end. Anyway, that's evidence that at least up until the mid-1970s, there was still clearly a difference between public bar and saloon bar pricing in some pubs. In 1976, this article bemoans too many big bars, with Brentford Licensing Committee speaking out against the idea of saloon bars, private bars and snugs all being lumped together to form one long bar. They wanted to maintain the price differential between the bars so that the hardest up section of the community is able to buy its beer without having to pay extra for the decorations, which they don't want anyway. Newspaper mentions of saloon bar pricing do seem to dry up in the early 1980s, so I assume it's around this time that the practice either was discontinued or at least became very uncommon. By 1988, this article talks of how pubs dispensed with different bars long ago, and later discusses how some of the nouveau riche made during the economic boom of the 1980s actually wanted a return to separate saloon bars and separate public bars and separate saloon bar and public bar pricing. It seems the author here believed by this point in time this was very much a thing of the past. It's easy today to look back disapprovingly on the Victorians with their strange pub interiors and the way they literally built those social divides into the fabric of the building. But if we're honest with ourselves, we still do the same today. We just go to different pubs. The gulf between the flat roof estate pub with its Sky Sports banner and the gastro pub in the leafy suburb is just as large as that between the public bar and the saloon bar. The prices are certainly different. The decor is unrecognisably different. Is that an improvement? Well, it's not for me to decide, but I know which of these two eras will have left the more interesting architectural legacy. Thanks very much for watching. Cheers.